Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. The Anti-Apartheid Network that the ANC drew on for its arms struggle from the early 1960s had multiple layers, which were rooted deep in the pre-arms struggle era. The first relates to the circumstances of the ANC's founding in 1912. South Africa in the 19th century had been, as the cliche goes, a mere geographical expression. And even after state formation in 1910, it was understood that its bounds were provisional and subject to expansion, at the very least to incorporate the protectorates Basutoland, Bechuanaland, and Swaziland, and also even settler-ruled Rhodesia. This broadness was reflected in the South African Native National Congress, which at its founding included representatives from all those territories. Even when the failure of South African expansion saw constituents of the ANC branch off, what was left were ostensibly territorially bound structures who still saw the South African organisation as their mother body, and in many cases felt themselves to be ANC, and could even prove documentation to prove it. The third was that there's a factor related to South Africa being a regional hub and attracting migrant workers from across the region. Many of these participate in ANC-led mass struggles during the 1950s, but they return home and form organizations that see themselves as of the ANC. Third layer relates to the arbitrariness of the borders that were established that often cut through communities. A vivid example was the Zeerust revolt in 1958, which created a cross-border diaspora. As Ariana Lissoni, Andrew Manson, and Bernard Mbenga and others have noted, these cross-border networks were activated by the early underground. By the late 1950s, new networks stretching across the border continent were being established as a consequence of decolonization. Various all-African peoples conferences enabled the ANC to network into this new Africa. These were important diplomatically, though not militarily, for it took a while for many states to have security establishments at all, let alone effective ones. That created a vacuum that was filled by yet another network, which is that as long ago as 1953, Nelson Mandela tasked his close friend Walter Sisulu with traveling to the People's Republic of China to inquire about obtaining weapons for an armed struggle. Sisulu's mission was unsuccessful, but the alliance with the South African Communist Party, which Sisulu joined, provided contacts behind the Iron Curtain. And following the Sharpeville massacre of March 1960, the South African Communist Party took the decision that December to form the nucleus of a structure capable of waging armed struggle. Mandela and Sisulu both attended that meeting, while Arthur Goldreich, who had fought in Israel's War of Independence, was tasked with heading to Czechoslovakia to obtain weapons. So there's a nucleus of 6 that goes to China and receives training there during 1961, around the time that the ANC gives Nelson Mandela authorization to form what will become known as Umkhonto Sizwe, working alongside his South African Communist Party allies. So Umkhonto Sizwe is formed in the latter part of 1961, and it launches in that December. Final pillar is the formal anti-apartheid movement dating to 1959 and the establishment of the boycott movement. In contrast to Africa and the communist world, these links with the West were limited to individuals and organizations and did not extend to the state. But these activists gave the movement a penetrative depth the others could not, simply because white Westerners can go to places in South Africa that other races, ethnicities, and nationalities cannot. So these are the networks that are involved as part of this anti-apartheid network. And for the bulk of the presentation, I'll outline how they networked with each other and with what changes over time. Nelson Mandela leaves South Africa clandestinely in January 1962 to attend a conference of the Pan-African Freedom Movement of East and Central Africa, hosted the following February in Ethiopia. He crosses into Bechuanaland, where he's hosted by Fish Kate-Seng, a Tswana activist who had been a defendant alongside Mandela and other ANC members in the treason trial from 1956. At the conference, Mandela holds discussions with representatives of Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Morocco, i.e. the nations on the continent with military establishments of note, about the possibility of organizing training for MK. It is also through that event that Mandela is availed of contacts that enable him to connect with the Africans with the most relevant experience, namely the Algerian FLN, whose War of Independence against France was reaching conclusion. Mandela visits Morocco in March 1962, where he has discussions with Algerian revolutionaries and receives firearms training. During Mandela's time abroad, he visits London and speaks with parliamentarians Joe Grimond and Hugh Gaitskell, but not about armed struggle in that case. The first fruits of Mandela's diplomacy are manifest in June 1962, when the ANC sends its first trainees abroad from South Africa. Their itinerary reveals a network of allied African nationalist movements in operation. In Bechuanaland, they rely on the network of Fish Kate-Seng and Motsamai Mpo. In southern Rhodesia, they call on the recently established Zimbabwe African People's Union of Joshua Nkomo, and in northern Rhodesia on Kenneth Kaunda's United National Independence Party. That enables them to get to independence. It's Tanganyika at the time, Tanzania, where they meet Mandela, who has by then received military training in Ethiopia, to where they are headed. Mandela is on his way back to South Africa, where he will, of course, be arrested on the 5th of August 1962, commencing his 27 years in incarceration. It's in March 1960 that Oliver Tambo is sent abroad to mobilize international support for the ANC, but it takes a while for him to coordinate all the various strands of the ANC's external activity. In 1962, he meets Raymond Mhlaba of the group of 6 members who had received the training in South Africa as that first South African communist nucleus. He's hurt because he's the leader of the ANC abroad and Mhlaba is an ANC member, but he knew nothing of his mission. The first he heard about it was when they meet in Tanganyika, and he tells him, I'm coming back from training, and Tambo didn't know anything about it. So the Organisation of African Unity is established in May 1963 to coordinate support for nationalist movements fighting minority rule, and that assistance is coordinated through its Liberation Committee. But problems soon emerge in terms of Africa's capacity to provide that support. North Africa contains the most effective military establishments, but feedback from training in Egypt is negative, noting the focus is on fatigue marches and physical endurance, which may be useful in desert warfare against Israel, but it's not ideally appropriate for guerrilla struggle. Problems also emerge in China, not over guerrilla training in which the Chinese are specialists, but the Sino-Soviet split. The training comes to feature strong anti-Soviet messages, which will cause tension between pro-Chinese and pro-Soviet factions in MK's OAU-provided camps in Tanzania. A choice needs to be made, and the ANC, influenced by its alliance with the South African Communist Party, chooses Moscow, with whom Oliver Tambo made his first official contact in 1964 through the auspices of the South African Communist Party, which is a very important network, therefore. In short, by a process of elimination, the external mission becomes dependent on Soviet networks for training in the military arts, which the ANC has by 1964 identified as the backbone of its entire liberation struggle. A problem the ANC faces from its Tanzanian base is the unwillingness of African states to offer themselves as infiltration pipelines. Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda is then experimenting with a non-violent policy. He's eventually prevailed on by Portuguese and Rhodesian incursions to countenance offering soldiers transit, but passage through Zambia still leaves the ANC short of South Africa. It only gets you to the Zambezi River, no close to South Africa. So at the OAU Liberation Committee's instigation, the ANC adopts a policy of joint operations with Allied liberations to help Allied liberation movements to help try to build Ho Chi Minh trails through neighboring territories. This leads to cooperation with Mozambique's Frelimo and Rhodesia's ZAPU, but both are defeated in 1967 and 1968, with the latter especially leading heavy casualties in the Wankie and Sipililo campaigns, which were mentioned in the previous paper. Though unsuccessful, the operations of the late 1960s are important diplomatically. The OA Liberation Committee has a policy of only recognizing fighting liberation movements, no campaigns, no African recognition, and no African recognition, no international recognition, because global imperatives cannot be ignored from the question of international solidarity between states. A loss of recognition would obviously be fatal for an external mission dependent on international support. So that's an overlooked dimension. People say it's a waste of these campaigns failed and they were useless, but without them, the ANC would not have survived. There's another very important organization, the ANC of Namibia. It's called the Southwest African National Union. It's the first. It goes into exile as the major organization. They don't wage an armed struggle. They don't get recognition. They disappear from history, and SWAPO becomes the leading liberation movement. This digression offers the East openings to expand its influence in Africa because, for reasons stated, it has the unique capacity in terms of training and equipment to capacitate movements to fight. In January 1969, there's a conference held in Khartoum where a conclave of Soviet-backed movements, namely the ANC, SWAPO, ZAPU, Frelimo, and the PAIGC from Guinea-Bissau, who come together as a formal network where they present themselves as authentic representatives of the people. Until then, the ANC's principal operational alliances, by operational I mean pertaining to attempts to advance revolutionary struggle within South Africa, were with political organizations, either liberation movements or states, whether African or behind the Iron Curtain. But by the late 1960s, MK had conducted no operations within South Africa since its internal structures were uprooted in 1963 and 1964. At the same time, most white and Indian members of the movement had been barred from locating in Africa owing to fears amongst those states of communist influence. They therefore centred in London, where they had been reduced to solidarity work for the unit, MK, that they had been partners in co-founding. I'm referring back to the South African Communist Party instigation of this initiative. It's through Ronnie Castrols, a member of the unit responsible for MK's first detonation on the 15th of December 1961, that links are formed with activists, some of them based at the LSE, some members of or adjacent to the British Communist Party, and this tale is conveyed in Castrol's book on the London recruits. These activists become responsible for leaflet bombings in the late 1960s. These are not acts of armed struggle, but attempts to prepare for it. They explode bucket bombs in public places, spreading leaflets that disseminate propaganda regarding the armed struggle and what the masses must do to prepare for it, to receive the guerrillas from abroad. An important illustration of the muscle the Soviets provide comes in 1969, when Tanzania says it can no longer accommodate Umkhonto Sizwe because it has been too inactive for too long and therefore poses a security risk. That could have led to the disbandment of the army, but the Soviets evacuated, of course, the army for a refresher course. Now, in Somalia, where a coup later in 1969 establishes a radical leftist organization, it becomes important in the next attempt to find a way home. The National Executive Committee member Flag Bushiela was killed in 1971, attempting to find a route to South Africa via the Caprivi Strip alongside SWAPO members. It highlights the difficulty of overland infiltration. If you just visualize, I mentioned there's an attempt with Frelimo which fails, there's an attempt with ZAPA which fails, now there's an attempt with SWAPO which fails. That's basically a whole geographical barrier to overland infiltration. The ANC has long pondered the possibilities of naval infiltration on the model of the Grandma landings in Cuba's revolution, and among the trainees in the Soviet Union are a group that had undertaken a naval course in Azerbaijan. These pieces form part of an initiative that will become known as Operation J. The London recruits are incorporated into this mission. The bucket bombs highlight their capacity as white Westerners to enter and travel within South Africa with relative freedom. Some of them reconnoitre the Eastern Cape coast, where the landings as part of Operation J are to be made. The London contacts also arrange for shipmen who are to captain the boats to transport from East Africa to South Africa. The guerrillas don't arrive as technical faults on the ship Aventura scupples several attempted embarkations. The mission is therefore converted to land and air as guerrillas are flown to Botswana and Swaziland. The London recruits are enlisted again as couriers for border friends crossings, but Alex Mumbaris, who is one of them, is arrested on the Botswana border after one of the recruits he had transported from Swaziland defects to the police. The police also use the interception to entice Sean Hosey, another London recruit, to travel to South Africa to provide supplies, but he's also arrested. The next major watershed in the struggle is the Portuguese coup in 1974, which is followed by a decision of the ANC-NEC to move leadership closer to home. Chris Hani and Thabo Mbeki, who were elected to NEC that year, moved to Lesotho and Botswana respectively, while Mbeki subsequently moves to Swaziland. It's when meeting the ANC's Moses Mabhida that King Sobhuza, with great emotion, pulls out his ANC card, revealing himself as an old member, reflecting that first layer of internationalization that I referred to. Mbeki is later joined by Jacob Zuma, but they're arrested in March 1976, again after a cross-border infiltration is intercepted. That's an important sub-theme which is going to become a major theme in the story if I can get through it all. The Soweto uprising then comes in June. Though the ANC has taken a blow, it's best able to absorb the subsequent exodus of student refugees. Hence, most of the few thousand refugees that leave the country join the organization. Independence for Angola and Mozambique, combined with the Soweto uprising, starts a new phase of armed struggle in which logistic difficulties are eased as the MPLA permits MK to organize camps in Angola from where recruits can be flown to Mozambique, where Frelimo offers transit routes from which cadres can be transported to Swaziland, then South Africa. These factors make this the ANC's favoured infiltration route in the late 70s and early 1980s. The logistic problems are thereby eased but not overcome. Transcontinental transport is not cheap, while border jumping poses an ongoing security risk. In that regard, however, the arbitrary nature of many African borders help. The frontiers cut across communities who are used to violating them consistently. The ANC is thus able to form links with these communities. The standard operational procedure involves the recruits being transported towards a border checkpoint by a driver with a clean record. The passengers then disembarked across the border via the bush with a local contact that knows the area and has networks there. The driver passes through the checkpoint legally and meets them on the other side. But there are many vulnerabilities. Those passing through the border gates, even if they have clean records, sometimes face suspicion precisely because of how often they cross without any valid pretext in many cases. There are also roadblocks which reveal contraband and illegal immigrants. The papers don't match with what's in the vehicle. Even when the border zones are successfully navigated, there are risks because the cadres are held either to places where they are strangers or returning to areas from which they have long been missing. Both pose a risk, and the unraveling of underground structures endangers courier networks. This system, pejoratively referred to by the security forces as commuter bombings, was a highly inefficient way of operating. The ideal was to cross the border, conduct your infiltration, but because you're a stranger there and there's a risk of being arrested, you go back to the frontline areas again. Very inefficient, very expensive, and in lives and money. The late 1970s saw the MK again draw on networks of internationalists. The Irish anti-apartheid movement, for example, reconnoitred the first raid of the MK Special Operations Unit, whose objectives were similar to the leaflet units in that they focused on armed propaganda, a strategy aimed at paving the way for sustainable armed struggle by preparing people to receive cadres. South African military intelligence archives bear testimony to repeated efforts to connect the ANC with the IRA and PLO as spokes of an axis of terror threatening the collective West, which South Africa wanted to be identified as being a part of. Direct contacts between the ANC and PLO were limited. If anything, the ANC's rival, the Pan-Africanist Congress, had closer direct contact as part of an alternative transnational network involving Colonel Gaddafi's Libya, where both PAC and PLO received training, and also Idi Amin's Uganda, where they were both in favor at the same time. Toivo Asheka of Georgia State University is the specialist on that, but the ANC's focus remained that of the platinum status Soviet-sponsored network of authentics. Now some of those movements have become governments as well, so it's a much stronger network. The international solidarity movement in the West was increasingly called on in the 1980s as MK fighters arrested in South Africa faced capital cases. As prisoner release and anti-death penalty campaigns grew in prominence, they connected armed struggle and international solidarity, two of what the ANC called the four pillars. The others were underground and mass struggle of its insurgency. That said, individual members of the international solidarity movement continued to actively participate in that struggle, with the likes of the Belgian Helene Pasteur's and the Dutchman Klaas de Jonge joining the Special Operations Unit, in which capacity they worked particularly closely with the Swaziland-based Politico-Military Committee. The state also extended its operations across borders and into the frontline states, which the ANC referred to as its forward areas. December 1986 operations saw the Swiss nationals Daniel Schneider and Corinne Bischoff taken, and Ibrahim Ismail Ibrahim, the leader of the Swaziland Politico-Military Committee, abducted. A consideration of these factors together provides the context for Operation Vula, one of the ANC's most famous initiatives. Vula was informed partly by the logistical, economic, security and other problems involved in waging a cross-border insurgency. The proposed solution was to shift command and control structures to within South Africa, in the language of the four pillars, to fuse mass, armed and underground struggle into one coherent pillar. Many initiatives described magisterially by Howard Burrell in his 1993 doctorate had been launched to achieve this throughout the 1980s, but none succeeded. The ANC's Carboy Conference of 1985 passed a resolution calling for a rededication to that goal, but once again implementation lagged, and it was eventually in mid-1986 that the NEC adopted Mac Maharaj's proposal and green-lighted what Oliver Tambo christened Operation Vula, the essence of which was to dispatch senior leaders into South Africa to build clandestine structures capable of providing all-round leadership of anti-apartheid resistance within South Africa. The preparations involved Maharaj, the head of the ANC's Political Reconstruction Committee, and Siphiwe Nyanda, one of the MK's leading frontline commanders, travelling to the Netherlands, where members of the Dutch International Anti-Apartheid Movement with links in the theatre world experimented with disguises that they could use to operate clandestinely. Connie Bram's Operation Vula tells the tale in detail, but more detailed preparations were undertaken in the Soviet Union. As with Operation J, battle groups Vula assembled personnel from previous operations. One was Operation Butterfly, which had unraveled in Natal in the mid-1980s, having created, for a brief period, integrated politico-military structures. Some of the veterans who escaped arrest were integrated into Vula. Another was Operation Bible, a legacy of the Mandla Judson Kuzweyo unit that had operated to Ibrahim Ishmael Ibrahim in Swaziland. The unit was rolled up in mid-1985, but its members were released in 1986, having managed to recruit a security branch officer who was turned by witnessing their suffering under torture. Vula has become known for its technological innovations, above all its encrypted, computerized system of messaging that connected its internal and external headquarters in London, Lusaka, Durban, and Johannesburg. Vula went operational when Maharaj and Nayanda entered South Africa in 1988, but internationalists were also installed in the frontline states and in Johannesburg, the latter including the Canadian Susan Grebeck and Dutch activists such as Maria Kind, Gert Reis, Conor Creyer, and others. Internationalists became involved in other ways. The film Secret Safari tells of Operation Laiki, whereby a company, Africa Hinterland Safaris, was established to transfer tourists between East and South Africa on a truck converted to conceal weapons by Rodney Wilkinson, a South African who masterminded MK's December 1982 attack on the Koeberg nuclear plant when he was an employee there. The ANC was by then able to stand on the shoulders of previous struggles, which enabled it to develop certain possibilities further than any predecessors. International solidarity resources that had previously been split among several movements came to be centered on South Africa. In other words, in the late 60s and early 70s, the focus of those opposed to minority rule in Africa had been on movements fighting Portuguese colonialism as much as the anti-apartheid struggle, not least because wars of liberation were at a much more advanced stage in those territories at that time. Then in the late 1970s, there was a rival focus on Zimbabwean independence. By the late 1980s, the focus was on the resistance to apartheid in South Africa and its dependency Namibia. But there's also another dimension to the solidarity that is conveyed in the memoirs of Ellen Groenink, the Dutch partner of Ivan Pillay, who was a participant in Operation Vula. This is that South Africa was in the 1960s one of many international struggles to which solidarity was shown. Besides Africa, there were others in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. But in the 1980s, she recounted, there was a sense that South Africa was the last good struggle, and that for reasons that are worth unpacking. The result was that the reason was that the results of transformation elsewhere had proved disappointing to many activists. In most instances, the international solidarity was attached to socialist commitment of some sort. By the late 1980s, there was a growing disillusionment over the state of that project. The world of the internationalists was shrinking in that regard. The focus on the basic principle of combating racism gave the South African struggle a moral dimension that was being lost elsewhere. The 9th of November 1989 should therefore be seen not as an event, but as a defining moment in a much longer process. Ivan Pillay was at the time in London coordinating Vula operations, but the attention of members of the external mission was drawn to news from East Europe. The overall impression from their accounts is not so much that they were opposed per se to national freedom in Eastern Europe, but that they interpreted the movement and the development in terms of its implications for South Africa, and they were generally extremely hostile to what they were seeing. In short, what was entailed was the unraveling of the Soviet-led network that gave the anti-apartheid movement its teeth, its military muscle, whatever military muscle it had. The implications of the Soviet Union's retreat had been seen that year with the implementation of Resolution 435 as part of the Namibian independence process, whereby the UN peacekeeping contingent was reduced in order to limit costs. That helped South Africa to retain control of security matters during that transition and to implement a military intelligence campaign called Operation Agree. The result, in terms of restricting SWAPO below two-thirds, was viewed by many within the South African security establishment as the best possible outcome in the new post-Cold War dispensation, and it contributed to F.W. de Klerk's February 1990 announcement unbanning the ANC, releasing Mandela, and agreeing to partake in open-ended constitutional negotiations. The ANC was conscious of the need to mitigate the military inferiority in the new dispensation, and it used its newfound legality not just to keep Vula going, but to build internal structures from returned exiles. Vula was uprooted in June 1990, with its scale and sophistication administering a shock, but importantly, international diplomatic pressure combined with the legalization of the ANC limited the state in its capacity to unravel the ANC's underground structures. What I mean is that by this stage, the state could not prevent the ANC from openly establishing internal structures capable of providing leadership. In that sense, debate over whether Vula was fully eradicated is misleading, for it focuses on tactical setbacks and away from a major strategic success. For example, Vula's encrypted system was uncovered and many leading activists were arrested, but the objective for which the operation was launched was achieved. The effectiveness of those structures was soon demonstrated. The war between Umkhonto and the ANC was at its core a war for control of the demographically critical townships ahead of the democratic elections in 1994 that F.W. de Klerk had committed himself to. And the ANC won that conflict through a combination of mass underground and, yes, armed struggle. Hundreds of Umkhonto leaders assassinated during the period testify to the existence of the latter. The ANC's growing influence had consequences for the role of its international networks. Those continue to be called upon, for example, arms smuggling operations through Mozambique, which was going through a particularly anarchic period in its history. But overall, the unbanned ANC was much less reliant on solidarity networks, owing to its increased capacity to rely on South African resources. The elections, as we know, passed peacefully, and South Africa is welcomed back as a full member of the international community and one of the biggest conclaves of world leaders outside the annual United Nations gathering. To recap, what we have is the formation of the ANC as an international organization from its founding in 1912. Even when political organization led to the separation of political organizations, there were bonds of solidarity that proved to be of enduring importance. The alliance with the South African Communist Party also inserted the conflict into the broader Cold War. Then there was also the spread of decolonization that offered a base of support amongst post-colonial states. The international anti-apartheid movement furthermore provided the movement with Western sources of support, but these were on an individual level, not the state, though these activists from the late 1960s onwards proved invaluable in possessing a mobility that other underground operatives lacked in South Africa. The progress of the struggle shifted the relationship between these pillars of the ANC's international network. And the history of the ANC's external mission could quite easily be written in terms of the networking of these networks. Regarding impact and lessons, it's important to note that there are key internal contradictions of apartheid that made its downfall inevitable. Apartheid is dying from the 1970s as a result of a silent social and economic revolution that makes territorial partition both unfeasible and undesirable. Activists struggling against it benefited from certain tailwinds that those adopting the same methods cannot count on. Hence, the results of applying the same methods will likely differ in different contexts, but the ANC does highlight new forms of organization that what Hakan Thorne mentions as the growth of an international civil society make possible in terms of networking, coordination, communication, and the development of appeals within international resonance. In that respect, South Africa is not at all like the classical people's wars of the late 20th century, such as Vietnam, China, and Algeria, but towards its end, it did assume many of the features that we would come to recognize in 21st insurgent war in terms of its urban focus, the lack of liberated zones, which required frequently cross-crossing hostile territory, the formation of underground cells which are networked with each other, operations launched deep within hostile territory, the battle for hearts and minds rather than land, and not least its employment of international networks of like-minded assistance. The ANC's trial and error response to this new landscape revealed certain shortcomings, but also numerous successes that mean its history cannot be discounted by those who would wish to understand the modern historical experience.